So, what's all this about? I look like I'm in a Sega CD game. Hi everybody, my name's Elliot Wright. I'm from Mississauga, Ontario. And if you're watching this, it may be because you've probably seen my last two videos, link in the description in case you're interested, where I demonstrated a small portion of a project that I've been working on to get East-West Quantum Leap Symphonic Orchestra, which I will henceforth refer to as EWQLSO because it's just so much easier, to work with Sibelius 7 using the advantages of Sibelius 7's 64-bit processing. Now, I was using a manual sound set in this instance, and I got a lot of really good, positive, and enthusiastic feedback. So, first off, thank you so much to everybody who replied and took the time to communicate with me about it. There were two really main types of questions that I got out of this whole experience, and one was, what are you talking about? And the other one was, can you please tell me how to do this? PowerPoint time. Now, this video will focus mostly on the first question, what I'm talking about, when I discuss or explain aspects of my manual sound set project. And the next video after this one, I'll talk a little more in depth about the system I'm using and go over some guidelines about how to maybe create a similar system yourself. What I'm going to cover in this presentation is, we'll start off by giving you a really easy version of what a sampler is and how it works. Then I'll talk a little bit about what Keyswitches are and roughly how they work. Then I'll talk a little more about Sibelius itself. I'll talk about the SoundID system that they have in SoundWorld. And I'll talk about what a manual sound set is and give you a little bit of a demonstration on how to set one up. Then I'll conclude with a little discussion on system requirements for the kind of project that I've demonstrated in the previous couple of videos, in case you're interested in what kind of system I'm using. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges that I've faced and that you might expect to face taking on a project kind of like this. So first off, what is a sampler? Let's do a little thought experiment at first. Let's imagine that you've got an instrument like this really badly drawn bassoon, and you record it playing every single note in its range, from the lowest note to the highest note, as many different ways that you can think of. And you record those to digital files, one note per file, and you end up with a whole bunch of little things called samples, which are little recordings of individual notes. Now you take these little files, these little samples, and you write a small program that assigns them each to the most appropriate key on a MIDI keyboard. What you've created then is called a patch. A patch usually uses the same type of articulation for every single note, usually. So you can expect a patch to be a self-contained keyboard with, say, sustained notes or staccato notes across all the different keys of the keyboard. And the idea is that you can then play a MIDI keyboard the same way that you would play a little piano or something, and each note will activate a recording of a real sound being played by a real live instrument, in the hopes of being able to create music that sounds like the real thing without actually having to have a real bassoon, in this case, on hand. Oh, look, he's happy. Okay, so what are key switches? Well, remember how we talked about patches just a second ago? Let's take several different patches, this time for a violin, where each different patch has a single articulation. Okay, we've got a patch there for staccato, another patch for muted notes, another patch for pizzicato, one for tremolo, and one for normal sustained notes. Now, take a moment and put yourself into the shoes of a sequencer-based composer. Okay, you're working in a sequencer program such as Pro Tools or what have you, and you load a single articulation into several different channels. Well, that works. But the problem is, a real instrument, as you know, plays many different types of articulations and can change between them fluently in the course of even just one passage. So you end up getting something that looks like this, where sometimes you've got to split up your passage across many different channels, and that can be really time-consuming and difficult, and it means that if you want to change the articulation of a specific note, you've got to move it up by an entire channel. It takes up more channels, and it's kind of inconvenient, so there's got to be a better way. This is where key switches come in. Here we've got a single patch, one keyboard, which has several articulations loaded into it. We've got an articulation for staccato, one for mute, one for pizzicato, one for tremolo. Basically, each one of these is its own sort of patch, but they're all loaded into one slot in your sequencer. Now, the way that you can activate these individually is by pressing notes on your MIDI keyboard that are well above or well below the actual functional range of the instrument that you're playing. These are called key switches, and in this drawing here I've got them on the far left-hand side of the keyboard, and I've labeled them with little dots to indicate that they're key switches. So let's say, for example, I press this one key over here, which I know activates the staccato patch inside of this key switching patch. I can play a passage of notes using the keyboard, and the sound that I'll get will sound like, hopefully, the real instrument playing staccato. Alternately, I can press a different key on the keyboard to activate, say, the pizzicato patch, play the same notes again through the keyboard, and the sound that I'll get is pizzicato. Now, the cool thing about this is that I can alternate between different articulations in order to use only one patch, one keyboard, to reasonably fluently play an instrument, and it helps to conserve space, and it helps to switch more fluently between the articulations, kind of like a real instrument. Here's an example of it actually occurring in play. Here we've got the white keys, and over here you see some blue keys. These are the actual key switches. Now I've got the current key switch that's activated is a regular sustaining key switch, and what I'm going to do is I'll play a little part through here, and then you'll see that this key switch will change to the next key over, which activates staccato. I'll play the same notes again, and you'll hear a staccato sound. And now with a staccato key switch. Alright, what are sound IDs? I'm going to talk a little bit about a system that happens in Sibelius, and I think it's a really genius system. Pretty intuitive, so you don't necessarily notice it if you're just a regular user until you realize just how integral the sound ID system in Sibelius is to projects like the one that I'm doing. You see, Sibelius has this system which allows it to read and play back your score as realistically as it can, or as appropriately as possible, by automatically identifying markings in your score. It uses the playback dictionary to then tell Sibelius, when it encounters a marking, to look for a certain sound among the patches which are available and loaded into Sibelius in order to create the best playback possible. You see, if you've got a passage in Sibelius, you see it like this, but Sibelius sees it like this. The notes that don't have any markings, it sees them as normal. When Sibelius is playing this back, the normal notes, it will use a sound ID called normal, or violin normal. It finds a staccato note, and it will play a sound ID called violin staccato. It finds pizzicato notes, and it will relay its notes to violin pizzicato, and same with tremolo. Essentially what's happening is, when Sibelius encounters a note with a marking, for example this staccato note, it looks into the playback dictionary, and the playback dictionary tells it that, oh hey, you're supposed to change the sound ID to staccato for this note whenever you encounter a staccato marking. So what Sibelius then does is it takes a look at your playback configuration, and it finds in the list of available sound IDs that you have loaded the most appropriate one, in this case staccato. Then it takes that note, or whatever notes are marked that way in the score, and plays them through whatever channel has been labeled as violin staccato. And of course, you being a smart person, you have loaded a patch into that channel which plays a staccato sound. So when those notes get routed through there, Sibelius plays this little virtual keyboard, your patch, and the sound that comes out is a staccato sound. So here's an example of it at work. So just like I showed you in the last slide, these first few notes over here on the left are marked as normal, and then these notes here where there's a staccato, they use a sound ID called violin staccato. Then these pizzicato notes, They all use the sound ID pizzicato, and this one uses tremolo. Now if you take a look over in the playback configuration window here, you'll see that my active devices, I've got 4 different instances of play, but really the only one I'm using for this particular example is the first one. If you go into the Manual Sound Sets tab, you can see that I've got all of my sound IDs loaded here. See, all I had to do here was I just went to channel 1 and I told Sibelius, using the pull down menu here, that this is violin, ensemble, regular, or normal, and that this one is violin ensemble staccato, this one's violin ensemble mute, pizzicato, and so on. Now what that does is it simply tells Sibelius which channels to send the sounds when it comes across a certain sound ID. Meanwhile, in play, I've loaded my normal sounds into track 1, my staccato sounds into track 2, mute sounds into track 3, and so on, so that they line up with the channels in here. This way, anytime that Sibelius sends a staccato signal, it'll send it through channel 2, and that will go into play, and it will activate whatever patch is on channel 2, which is my staccato patch. Essentially, it's just an exercise in lining up your sound IDs here with the patches that you load into play. Now let's talk a little bit about system requirements. Now this is looking more forward into the next video, where I'll be talking about how I put together the system that I used for the previous 2 videos that I released, and to talk about what kind of computer you need to look into and what kind of requirements you have to think about if you're putting together a system to do this kind of thing yourself. First off, you've got to think about RAM. That was the thing that really broke it for me when I was trying to originally do a system like this on a much smaller computer. If you do load a lot of RAM into your machine, you need to still be able to access that RAM. So that means you need the right operating system. You need a 64-bit operating system, a 64-bit host, and a 64-bit plugin. And each of those different elements, the operating system, the host, and the plugin, they each live inside one another. The plugin lives inside the host lives inside the operating system, so you need them all to have the most access possible, so make them all 64-bit. I should mention that Sibelius 7, as of the date of this particular recording, is currently, as I understand, the only 64-bit notation program, as far as I know. And the plugin, EWQLSO, works on a program called Play, which is available in a 64-bit plugin. The next thing is, even if you've got all the RAM that you need, you're going to need to deal with some load times. I mean, it takes a little while for your computer to pull all these little digital recordings of all these notes off of the disk. So you need a fast computer, and you need to set up your system so that there are as few bottlenecks or stoppages in the file retrieval system. What that means is, right off the bat, you need a fast processor to pull these files as quickly as you can, and you should probably use solid-state drives. That's what I would recommend. Solid-state drives, in case you're not familiar, they are, they're solid-state. They have no moving parts. The computer's electrical impulse comes in, finds the file, impulse comes back out. File retrieval is almost instant. It should go without saying that you need a high-quality sound card, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Generally, the rule is when you're setting up your system or building your computer, if you're going to do that kind of thing, it's much better to take the optimal system requirements and beat them and exceed them by as much as you can, and have a system that runs way faster than necessary, than to risk having a system that just barely can accommodate what you're doing, or worse, just comes up short and you have to buy new equipment and upgrade it. Think future-proofing. Make sure that your computer will be able to continue to serve you even if you were to upgrade. My system, as it stands, I've got a processor, which is an Intel Core i7. I have a 64-bit operating system. It's Windows. I am normally a Mac person. If you are a Mac person, you can use Snow Leopard and Lion. As far as drives go, I've got 4 solid-state drives. They're not particularly big, but they're not small either. They're 120 gigabytes each. And what I've done is I've installed 1 choir per drive. So one drive has my operating system and all of my programs and the percussion section of EWQLSO. Another drive has all the string sections. The next drive has all the brass, and the other drive has all the woodwinds. The reason for this is, even though they're solid-state drives and they have great retrieval times, it's still good to put one choir on each drive so that it takes the pressure off of the drive. So your computer isn't going to the same drive trying to get 1,000 samples at the same time. My RAM, 24 gigabytes of high-speed RAM, which was actually made to work with the Intel Core i7, and I'm using this Gigabyte X58A UD3R motherboard. I have no idea what that means, but it was also built to accommodate the Intel Core i7. This is a pretty good combination because now I've got a motherboard, core, and RAM that all work together, and they were all built to work together. My sound card is a Creative Sound Blaster XFI Titanium Fatality Champion series, which is a huge mouthful. And as you can tell by the spelling of the word fatality, this is a gamer card. There are a lot of really high-end and somewhat expensive sound cards out there that are really geared towards recording, so they're great at taking analog sound and turning it into digital sound and vice versa. But they're not necessarily as well suited to heavy sampler duty. So generally a good gaming card is a great addition to this kind of system. And of course, there's the usual stuff like a graphics card, optical drives, stuff that makes your computer a computer, basically. Now, I don't want to leave you on a low note, but I want to talk a little bit about some challenges that you may encounter going into this project. The first one is CPU power. We talked about that just now. But generally, what you should do is, regardless of if you've got a big high-end computer like this one, it's important to understand RAM, processing power, like multi-core processing, and understand stuff about sound cards so that you can understand what your system is capable of, what you might want to upgrade if you are of the mind to upgrade, and to basically understand what you can or cannot do with your current system, or what kind of system you need to do the stuff that you want to do. The next rule is that you're limited to the articulations you have. Now, limited is sort of a light term here because EWQLSO and other major sample libraries can be pretty expansive and pretty complete, which is great. But what you got to bear in mind is you may have an idea in your head that can't quite be perfectly replicated using the sample library. And the reason is that in order to eliminate the human limitations of these instruments, we've created digital instruments that have their own limitations, which is kind of an interesting sort of trade-off. You see, you no longer have to worry about the musician getting tired or writing a part that's too complex for them because you've got a computer playing it back. But now you have to make sure that you are using the sounds that are available to that computerized instrument and that you're not trying to do anything that hasn't been recorded into that articulation file already. Next is this. Sibelius is a great program. It makes great scores, and that's the whole reason why we're doing this project on Sibelius. The trade-off is this, though. It's not a sequencer, it's not exactly a sequencer. There are still some functions that it's not quite as good at as a sequencer is, which is understandable because it's a notation program. Things like automation, equalizing, like graphic EQ, it's not as easy to do it in Sibelius. But always bear in mind, the goal here is to create reasonably realistic playback, but still get a great score, and that's why we're using Sibelius. The next one is this. If you are using a program like Sibelius to do a project like the one that I've demonstrated, you'll notice that what I'm talking about in my previous two videos and what I'll talk about in my next video is all about taking the individual sampled instruments and treating them like individual real instruments. My whole score is made up of a bunch of solo instruments in the woodwinds and the brass. I'm treating each individual staff like its own instrument, and that means that I can't pull shortcuts like I might be able to pull in a sequencer. If you're working in a sequencer, you can load up, say, a 6 horns patch and a full string ensemble patch and play in block chords or play as though you're playing the piano, and you can get a pretty decent sound, and I don't want to discredit people who are doing that, but you can't quite do it the same way in Sibelius because we're treating the instruments as individual instruments, and the only way to get them to sound right is to write in a manner which actually makes the real instruments sound right. It's pretty cool because now that we've got instruments that are so realistic, we actually have to write for them like they're real. Also bear in mind that if you are creating a score, you're probably thinking about getting real people to play it. So bear in mind that although these samplers can play things that humans can't play, try not to write anything that a human can't actually play. Lastly, the learning curve. It's more just the project itself. Be ready to have to learn a lot about sound sets, sound IDs. Use Sibelius reference, it's great. And if you are really stumped on something, go on to the Sibelius help forums, they're wonderful. Generally, this is probably the most engaging challenge of the whole project. It's what makes it really worthwhile. And I think that you'll find that putting this project together yourself will force you to learn so much about Sibelius and about EWQLSO that by the time that you produce your actual own system, the payoff is great because you know how it works intimately and you learn a lot about the actual system that's running it. Well, that'll about do it for today. Thank you for watching. If you're interested in trying out this system for yourself, stay tuned for my next video, which should be coming in the next week or so, where I'll talk a little bit more in depth about the kind of stuff that I did in my own personal system and some guidelines for setting it up for yourself and how to use it.